Archbishops of Canterbury, Armagh and Dublin, Bishop of Spain, other bishops, clerical colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. As many of you will be aware, we've had a very interesting and eventful day here in St. Patrick's. We had the large service to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the Disestablishment of the Church of Ireland earlier at 3 o'clock today, at which we were so honoured and privileged to have the Archbishop of Canterbury as the preacher. Now, that event, of course, coincided with a very busy day in the life of the Swift Festival 2019. And with that in mind, very much, it was decided that as part of the day's events and with reference to the Swift Festival, which was happening in Marsh's Library while we were in St. Patrick's Cathedral, that we would have a panel discussion, and that the discussion would relate to Swift and relate also to what we've been talking and thinking about earlier. So in that regard, I wish to pay at the outset a word of sincere thanks to a number of people who were involved with this, to Andrew Smith from the Cathedral here, who liaised with Caoimhe Leppard from Archbishop Jackson's office in Church House, and drew up a very interesting panel of speakers to whom we'll be turning in a moment. But our huge thanks are due to Mr. Bryan Dobson for coordinating this today. He's going to introduce the panelists, to whom I am particularly and personally grateful. So thank you very much, Bryan, and thank you to all who are featuring on the panel. It's very much appreciated indeed as part of the events of today. And over now to you, Bryan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Dean. Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to St. Patrick's on this rather wet and damp Saturday night. So it's very encouraging to see so many of you have taken the trouble to be with us here this evening. I just want to check, first of all, that everybody can hear me, including those of you right down the very back. I am audible, am I? In the full length of the cathedral. Yes, you're giving me a wave, so I'll take that as an answer in the affirmative. It's a great pleasure for me to be here to take part, to moderate this conversation this evening. What we wanted to talk about this evening was identity. Identity. Why identity? Well, of course, we are marking this year the 150th anniversary of the Disestablishment of the Church of Ireland. And this was a moment in the history of the Anglican Church on the island of Ireland when its identity was plainly very much in flux. Many members of the Church of Ireland at that time were wondering what was the future for their church, what was its identity in the years ahead, what would be its relationship with the changing Irish state and the society around it. So identity in the context of what was happening 150 years ago. And of course, also, we mark this month, at the end of November, the birthday of Dean Jonathan Swift. An absolutely fascinating character, someone whose identity had many different layers to it. An Irishman who sought advancement in the church in England, who, to his disappointment, was sent back to Ireland and yet made such a remarkable impact here in this very cathedral and in this city of Dublin. Somebody who was committed to the Reformed Church of the day. He very much supported the establishment of the Church of Ireland at that time, and yet, of course, he was somebody who was intensely patriotic and argued again and again against the misrule of Ireland, sometimes by the English, sometimes by others. So somebody whose identity was always intriguing and seemed to contain with it very many contradictions. So that's why we're going to talk about identity with our panel, who it's my very great pleasure to introduce to you this evening. Already we have welcomed here to St. Patrick's this afternoon the Most Reverend Justin Welby, Archbishop of Canterbury, and we are delighted that he has consented to take part in our discussion this evening. With him we have former President Mary McAleese, a canon lawyer, among her many other achievements, and someone who has spoken on these issues during her presidency and since. We also have the writer and economist David McWilliams, who we're delighted to welcome here. And finally, on my left, we have Dr. Ida Milne, who is a historian and the co-editor of a recent publication, a tremendous piece of work called Protestant and Irish, which looks at the the experience of Protestants in the independent Irish state since the early 1920s. And at the very end there we have Andrew Smith, who is the education officer with the Cathedral. And that brings me to my next point. Andrew is armed with his laptop, and we're inviting you, and indeed those of you who are watching us, I believe, on the Cathedral's Facebook page, we're inviting you to take part in our conversation by submitting questions or comments. And how can people do that, Andrew? What is the hashtag?
So they can actually submit the questions by Twitter via hashtag #YourChanceToAsk.
Okay,
so hashtag
your chance
to ask.
Okay, and we'll be coming to you and you'll be alerting me to some of the questions coming in. So, identity then, particularly panel, in the context of the issues that surrounded Swift in his day and what was happening to the Church of Ireland and on the island of Ireland 150 years ago. There the concerns were about national identity, religious identity. Of course, in the more contemporary terms, we have other issues in relation to how we include people of different racial identities in Ireland. There's questions of gender, sexual orientation. But I want to, before I perhaps come to some of those, just to ask each of you the same question. And it is this. How do you describe your identity? What makes you who you are? So no pressure. Very simple question to start with. Dr. McAleese.
Oh, thank you, Bryan. So used to being picked on. Thank you very much, and thank you for the chance to be here. Well, I grew up in Belfast, born in Belfast in Ardoyne, and I think place starts to shape you almost immediately. Belfast, a deeply divided and sectarian city. Again, that starts to shape you. I was not born a Catholic, unlike Mary, Queen of Scots. Any of you have seen the film? Anybody seen the recent film? You will know that it opens with the line, Mary, Queen of Scots was born a Catholic. Ruined the film for me. We were in the lighthouse with my children, and I immediately said, that is theologically, canonically and juridically incorrect. And from the far end of the row, my son also called Justin, said, Mum, we're all theologically literate in this row. Would you shut up and let us watch the film? But the truth is, we're baptized into a faith in the Catholic Church. We become Catholic by baptism. And so I grew up in I grew up actually in a Protestant area of Belfast, for which I'm very grateful, because whereas all the Catholics went to the one church, I realized very quickly that all the Protestants didn't. So I became very familiar with, First Presbyterian, Second Presbyterian, Methodist, and the Gospel halls. And of course, the Church of Ireland. My father's best friend was our local Church of Ireland minister, who regularly rambled in our house. So it was a house where all the issues of identity, which actually clustered around religion, whether we liked it or not. I mean, I think there was huge resistance to the idea for a long time that the problems on this island had such a strong religious component. But I think in fairness to a former minister of a government, Conor Cruise O'Brien, very long time ago said that if religion was a red herring, it was a red herring the size of a whale. And the truth of the matter was, I grew up in what I often describe as the Yaboo school of theology, where my God was bigger than their God, better than their God. The Protestant neighbours thought they had God on their side. The Catholic neighbours thought that we had God on our side. And clearly these could not possibly have been the same God. So that our identities grew up around very much a bipolar God, a dysfunctional notion of God. And I think many of us, and I would put myself very much in this category, have spent a long time trying to shake off the hermetic seal that put around identity. And we've tried to shake that off to find what? To find the Christ in each other. Particularly those of us who claim to be Christians. I think it was a dreadful thing to grow up with a sense that other people were less Christian, other people were more Christian, other people weren't Christian at all. That's dangerous. It corrupts the gospel. It makes Christ lack credibility. And I was very taken, very moved actually this evening at the start of the service here with the hymn that was chosen, because the hymn that was chosen has the words in it, grant thy people holy longing for the fellowship of old. And that fellowship of old goes back to a tradition before we were divided into denominationalism. Nowadays we can't turn the clock back, but we really do have to learn to live with difference without wanting to proselytize it into my identity. I think we came from tribes that only wanted to engage if we could turn you into me and you could turn me into you. And we've got to learn to live, accept and love as one another. And identity has both made us, but also to some extent maybe crippled us.
All right. And that sets the scene for a number of themes which we'll come back to, I think, in the course of the conversation. But Archbishop Welby, what about the same question to you? How do you describe your identity? In the sense of identity, what makes you who you are?
I'm really struck by what Mary has said. I think, let me give you a couple of very quick pen pictures. One is 3 years ago, I can't quite remember now. I'm in a scout hut in my own diocese of Canterbury, and it's the Wednesday before Easter. And I'm in the middle of a really busy week, and it's a scout hut. It's full of young people, children charging around and crashing about, and I'm sort of engaged in doing whatever you do in these occasions, looking for cover, really. And my phone buzzes, and it's a text from a newspaper man called Charles Moore, who used to be the editor of the London Daily Telegraph, and it says, test confirms 99.93% likelihood that Anthony Montague Bryan is your father.
Your father?
My father. And so I put the phone back in and went back into my pocket and went back to crashing around with the kids. Now, Anthony Montague Bryan was not the man I grew up thinking was my father. There'll be people in here, it's about 1 in 100, so there'll be several other people here, the same position. I grew up in a very dysfunctional family. Parents never stuck together for, I think, after about 3 weeks, but I got conceived, or I thought I had in that time. And it was only 3 or 4 years ago that it was discovered through Charles sitting at a party next to someone who said, well, my husband is actually the father of the Archbishop of Canterbury. And a late husband and so he came to see me and he said this, and I said rubbish. I grew up with my father. He had custody of me after my parents divorced. I remember him well. And he said, no, I think this is true. I said, oh, don't be ridiculous. Can you get any DNA? We'll do a DNA test. And that led to that text. It was all in the Daily Telegraph published it. And it was all over the press. It was during the Brexit campaign. That's how I remember when it was. So the press was very pleased to have something else to talk about. Little did they know. And so they were very nice, the paper. They gave me a couple of weeks to sort of mull this over. And I sat down. I sat down with my colleagues and told them this a few days before publication, and we talked about how to handle it with you guys. And my comms director went downstairs, and I was just sitting there thinking. I emailed to her and said, I just don't know how we're going to deal with this. I'm not worried about it. I know my identity is who I am in Jesus Christ, and I don't need to worry about anything else. That hasn't changed.
But the man who you thought was your father, who you presumed had handed on to you various characteristics or qualities which you might expect, you discover at this stage in your life, he's not your...
Yeah, he died in 1977. No, he wasn't. He definitely, emphatically wasn't. And I discovered I had a half-sister and all kinds of things. So, where's my identity? For me, I think we spend our lives in a process. As a Christian, I would say our Christian journey is a journey of discovering who we really are in God. as Christians. And I don't know who other people are at the depths of their being any more than they do. I don't really know who I am, except I know that Jesus Christ knows who I am. And I can rest content in that. So for me, that's where I find identity.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing. It's an extraordinary story. Maybe people had heard it because eventually it was published.
It was published. Yeah, yeah. It caused quite a bit of fuss.
I can imagine.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Ida, let me come to you. Because you've written about Protestant identity in Southern Ireland since independence, but just you personally, what's your sense of your own identity, of where you come from, of what makes you who you are?
I grew up in a family in Wexford, a very large Protestant family, interconnected very closely to all the other Protestant families in Wexford, as we do. And we have 400 plus years there. Count that back. It's very awkward history. We probably came in with Cromwell. We're not quite sure. So we have a very strong sense of Protestant identity, but we also have a very strong sense of integration peacefully into the community, which, given that in 1798 there was a lot of trouble in Wexford, and given that my own family, the Elms family, my grandmother's family, were right beside Carrickburn Hill and right beside Scullabogue, the barn burning incident, we were very well minded by our Catholic neighbours. We were actually saved in 1798, brought into Old Ross. My many times great-grandfather was 3 years of age. He was put into a milk churn up to his neck in milk, and by the time he got into Old Ross, he'd drunk all the milk and never broke a bone in his life as a result. But what nobody ever says is that it actually had to be the Catholic neighbours and rebels who saved us at that stage. And the same thing happened again in 1922 or so, when my grandfather was probably selling straw to the British Army. The IRA dug a grave for him. But the local neighbours spoke up for him and made sure that he was, he's a GA player, he's a good lad locally, he's a good neighbour. And I suppose we were brought up very close into the community and integrated into the community. The only difference really was church on a Sunday. And, some of the prayers, but we tried to get those as close as possible. So then I moved as, in my teens and 20s up to Dublin. And I was a journalist for a while. I worked in independent newspapers, and that brought me something which, looking back on, is a great benefit as a historian. It brought me into contact with working class Dublin, and I learned something that enabled to move me out of my class and out of my economic background and into city life. And both between the people who worked in the Independent and the community who would put things like small ads for Moore Street, who would come in that we would talk to and things like that. And I also work as my main field of history is as a historian of disease. So that is something that has enabled me as an oral historian, I think, to do good work, I suppose, to empathise with other people, and it has enriched my life and given me much broader understanding. After that, when I left the Independent and went into history, I later got a fellowship to move to Belfast. And again, that brought me in engaging with my background in Protestantism. And why was it so different in Wexford, even though we had 1798, compared to the North? Why did we commemorate in a different way? Why, is Wexford relatively peaceful? It mightn't be, but it is. So I think all those things have shaped my identity, and particularly brought me, when Ian Dalton and I started to do this book, Protestant and Irish, was to reflect on all these things. And we spent a lot of time actually rowing with each other about who we are and why he was different, his background was different to mine, and which one was the truer Protestant experience in the South.
The more authentic.
Yeah.
Well, and I want to come back to that, because I think it's very interesting, some of the work you've done and as published in that book and elsewhere. But David McWilliams, who are you?
Don't ask me now. You have to figure that thing out. I'm going to maybe disappoint. I don't have this pivotal moment in my youth that identified me as one tribe or another. I'm pretty much a product of suburban Dublin in all its various incarnations. In fact, the road we were brought up, my father described me as Catholics on the way up and Protestants on the way down, which is in Monkstown. So that was, I thought, quite a nice way of explaining who was knocking around. I'm very much Irish. I've never felt anything other than Irish. I never really thought that much about identity until I met a very very trendy girl from Northern Ireland who turned into a Protestant mother. If you can explain how that happens when Northern Irish prods hanging out with you, they're fine, then once they become mothers, they get all Protestant. And so consequently, this was most evidenced in our relationship. My wife and my mother are here, so I'll be killed both ways on the way home. But then I began to think about Ireland and identity and not religion, but I think identity is a feeling for people. Like, where do I feel I belong? It's not an absolute thing. You don't wake up in the morning, you brush your teeth and say, I'm this person, I'm from this tribe. But it's a feeling which is amplified when other feelings are amplified. I was very intrigued that despite living in Dublin, that both our children were born in Dundonald in East Belfast, despite there being loads of hospitals in Dublin. And I never really asked why. I still haven't. I'll ask the missus on the way home. And then, of course, when you marry into a northern family, a northern Protestant family, but not particularly observant or particularly embracing, but from the tradition, then you tend to have very interesting late-night conversations. And I always remember my father-in-law who passed away, whose name was Billy, obviously, and one night after copious amounts of Malbec, we are discussing the issues of the day in the island, and I'm giving my usual, and what about this, and what about that, and the other thing. And he just looked at me and says, "You sound Jesuitical." And that was not a compliment. So I suppose, our children are born in Belfast, we live here, we're up and down all the time. We have the discussions regularly about identity, about what's going to happen, post-Brexit, unification, if that happens, what does it mean? When we have these conversations, it just makes us kind of unusual in terms of an Irish family, because we live in this from both sides. But, in terms of me, I just grew up in a really nice, decent suburban house with no huge... I really can't best the Archbishop story, which is fantastic. I mean, I can't best that, but no huge moments that would have asked me the question, who am I? And I think who you become is just a process of getting to know yourself over a good few decades. Yeah. And we're still not there yet.
Yeah. Well, you sound like somebody who's comfortable, as indeed you all do, comfortable with yourselves, comfortable with your own identity. Not, I'm sure, complacent, but at ease in that general sense. So having talked to you about your personal, I want to sort of bring back the perspective a bit and widen it out a little. And I want to talk a little bit about religious identity. We're sitting here in this great cathedral church, and we know we live in a society which is increasingly secularized, where the number of people who are involved in weekly church attendance is declining, where there are tensions or have been tensions between church and state in this country certainly, and indeed even tensions within the Christian denominations on the island of Ireland over various issues, a lot of them to do with sexual morality. But I'm just wondering if I might, Dr. McAleese, put the question to you about what you think is still the importance of religious identity or not in Ireland. And I was looking at the recent census figures where there's an increasing number of people who say they've no religion. It's about 10% now and rising. But that the vast majority in the Republic, 78%, declare themselves to be Catholic. I think we can safely say 78% are not practicing week in, week out Catholics. But is that religious identity still something you think that's important to people?
I think it would be wrong to underestimate it. Honestly, I think that very often we make the mistake of underestimating how important religion and religious identity and a sense of religious identity are to people. Worldwide, 5 out of 7 people in the world identifies with some religion or other. The Christian Church, well over 2 billion people in the world identify as Christian, well over 2 billion identify as Muslim. There's half the world's population who identify with a religious sensibility. Now, that doesn't bother me. I think that a religious sensibility, a sense of purpose, a belief in God, a belief that you're not alone in the world, these are things that have meant a lot to me over the course of my life. The idea that I'm loved by a God, and that I'm in turn expected to love and to find ways of forgiving and find ways of drawing compassion even when I don't necessarily really want to feel that. I think all of that is to the good. I think a base value system that is about goodness and that exists in all the big Abrahamic faiths and in others is wonderful. The problem is when those religious sensibilities become bunkers that allow you to despise the people outside the bunker, that become sources of, whether it is religious contempt or religiously inspired contempt, or that toxic mix of religion and politics, which can inspire contempt, and that holds whole countries, whole cultures, whole centuries in thrall to things that are humanly indecent. Now, so that's where I would have that's where I think today, we here in Ireland, for example, I think are shaking ourselves out of that very bunkered over-identification with religion, in the sense of religion as something that marks me as different and better than the other. I think what we're working our way towards now is a much greater acceptance of the otherness of the other. And that's the place and the space that I feel most excited about. It's taken us a very long time to get here. Education has played a big role in that. Ecumenism has played a role in it. Wonderful leadership has played a role in it. But in the end, if those religious identifications are about the business of saying, I'm better than you, I'm entitled to despise you, I will not engage with you humanly, you are not a member of my community, we are so different, we will never be community to each other, then for me, we've really done a huge disservice to the Christian gospel. And what the broader sense of religiosity has to me to be about is exactly what it said in that song, to find in ourselves that well of longing to be part of a community big enough to embrace all of us, while at the same time acknowledging difference.
Archbishop, the Church of England is still the established church. You sit in the House of Lords, I think I'm correct in saying, and on the Privy Council.
Yes.
So it still has that very strong official formal connection with the English state, and yet I think sometimes Britain is referred to as a post-religious society, where very many people have abandoned religious practice. Does religion still matter to British people? Do you think?
I think you said 75%.
Yes, still identify as Catholic here.
Yeah.
In England, I'm using the word England quite carefully, 47% of the population say they have any faith at all, belong to a faith group. So 53% don't.
No. Yeah.
And 14% say that they're Church of England. So the facts would seem to indicate it has less and less impact. But other things do have an impact. One of the things that I think I've noticed most, and I think, again, picking up what Mary was saying, the power of a religious worldview that gives you principles and values is society changing. Go back to the foundation of the European Union in the late 40s, early 50s. It was founded by mainly Catholics with an absolute solidly based view on the dignity of the human being and the need to stop young men principally killing each other on the battlefields of Europe. And to that extent, for 70 years, and this is not a political point to do with the election, whether it's still applicable or not is a party political question that England, and I'm not talking about that or making a comment on that. So we're in Purdah, so I have to go in for this stuff. But I'm really genuinely not saying that. But historically, for 70 years, the European Union managed to stop wars in Western Europe. But in the last 20 or 30 years, we've seen the re-emergence, and particularly in the last 10, since the financial crash of 08-09, where inequalities and so on blew open the sense of wholeness. We've seen a re-emergence of a contrary stream within our society. And that stream is philosophically based. It goes back to Nietzsche and his idea of the will to power. But it's also, there's been a re-emergence of a particularly fearsome jurist and philosopher of the 30s, who was Hitler's favorite jurist, a guy called Schmidt. And obviously he's complicated, but in one sentence, he said, we find our identity by having an enemy. And this is where religion comes in. Mm-hmm. Because when misused, and I've seen this all around the world, religion is how you, in simple terms, identify an enemy in a society where most people, and in a world where most people are religious. So it could be, with certain people, it will be Islam. Historically, it's been Judaism. In many places today, it's Christians. Within the Christian world, it could be Protestants or Catholics. And therefore, the role of religion is not normally to create difference. The strongest stream since the Second World War has been of reconciliation and building bridges. But it is a hook on which you can hang difference. And if you hang difference and seek enemies through that hook for long enough, the hook becomes the reality of the problem.
That's very interesting, and I'd like on that point to bring in Ida, because I think this goes to what you've been writing about, Ida, challenging the traditional view of the place of Protestants, a tiny minority, even in the past when the numbers were bigger, still a very small minority, certainly in the what is now the Republic of Ireland. And this view, this kind of big house view of Southern Protestants, and a climate of tension and hostility between the two communities, the kind of thing that the Archbishop is cautioning against. But you say that's not actually, certainly not the full picture, and maybe not even the true picture.
Yeah, I think we've tended to emphasise the louder noise, just as we've emphasised the louder noise of, say, Northern Protestantism compared to Southern Protestantism. But the louder noise of the burning of the big houses and things like that, if you look around the country and see the big houses that were burned, in Wexford, for example, we had very few big houses burnt. And locally to me, there are 4 big houses, and I'm told from people who knew at the time that they actually rowed over which they were told by the local IRA they had to burn one of the houses. They didn't want to burn any of them. So they ended up actually burning the house that belonged to Molly Keane's family, the Screens, because they weren't from Wexford originally. They were originally Northern. And they didn't particularly dislike the Screens, but it was just, they liked the other people very much. And one of the families was told to go away for a while by their gardener, who was in the IRA, and to come back when all that trouble was over, and that he would save the house. So there were all these very complicated stories, even in those big house stories. But a lot of what you see, the Protestantism of particularly the southeast, I suppose, is tenant farmers. They're not well off. Some of them might have 15, 20 acres. And my own family is an exception. We had quite a big farm, 300-400 acres. But we are not typical. And that's far. The kind of people I knew and I grew up with were very far from the public image of Protestant as landlord. That was particularly promulgated by certain sectors of I suppose, historian as much as anything. Yeah,
and cultural identity, because you also write about the extent to which the GAA is such an integral part of life for everybody, regardless of religious denomination in the part of the country you come from.
Absolutely. I was quite shocked to be told one time, that Protestants didn't engage with the GAA because it was too Catholic and too nationalist. And we only knew one flag. You know, it was, you know, the green, white and gold, and that was it. But also we had a hurling pitch on the land in the 1950s and 1960s. And my dad said it was because of tickets, because he couldn't get any tickets from the local club. So he set up his own little club for a while. But it was, of course, also Wexford in the 50s and 60s when Wexford was in its hurling golden age.
Yes, yeah.
So Protestants, just like anybody else, wanted to be engaged with.
Yeah, yeah.
The other thing, you know, I would have done Irish dancing. My mother would very self-consciously have sent myself and my sisters. I was the worst Irish dancer ever. But you know, that was something you don't expect, Irishness. And two of my mother and my sister both have degrees in Irish. And again, that's something people will say to you, oh, you're Protestant, you mustn't be able to speak Irish. Yeah.
David, the Archbishop was saying in his sermon earlier today that one of the strengths of the Church of Ireland, one of its achievements since disestablishment, has to be a church without borders between North and South, and indeed to break down borders between different Christian denominations. You travel north and south. You have, as you said, family contacts now north of the border. Do you detect border differences, different ways of looking at some of these issues?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I think that maybe I'll take a different tack. I mean, because of Shan and I being married, because we have children who are not baptised, because neither of us are fortunate enough, actually, maybe to have the faith you guys have. I look at religion in Ireland, and when I hear Freud talked about the narcissism of small differences, which is really destructive. Yeah. So you identify, well, you know what? You know, I watch Rangers, you watch Celtic. I say bacon, you say rashers. I say H, you say H. These are all little tells, okay? And if you elevate those up to a narrative that this person is different to you, I think we have failed in Ireland really badly at actually removing this stain of narcissism out of our discourse. In the South, it's much more progressive, much more liberal, and I believe a much better country to live in than the country I was born in and I grew up in. And part of that was that the church, the Catholic Church, was elbowed out. With respect to when I go up north, what I'm always intrigued about in the north is the fact that nobody, and Mary, you'll know all about this, it's the Seamus-Heaney, whatever you say nothing until you say it. And then all hell breaks loose.
Correct.
and it's really a matter. So my experience with religion here, Bryan, is quite different. I always think that religion is about character. You know, what we talk about religion, it's actually about the type of person you are. And in recent years, I've listened to, unfortunately, to a lot of funerals of parents, of friends. And I'm very, very interested in what people eulogize about at the end of someone's life. Yeah? They don't say, oh, he was the chief executive of this company, or he got that many points in his leaving cert, or they had a big house. It's usually, she was generous, she was kind, she was decent. You know, you'll know this when you get up. The eulogy self, this is what I find religion is interesting, because it allows people the space to talk about deep things. So the person is remembered for being generous, for an act of kindness, for being a decent skin, not for being the person with money in the bank. And unfortunately, economics, my own profession, has elevated what I would call these CV traits and characteristics, and has denigrated eulogy characteristics. And I think the role of religion is to try and elbow out economics a wee bit as being the dominant moral narrative of both Ireland, which it has become, and the United Kingdom. And if I see, do I see the Church of Ireland better equipped? Yes, I do, actually. Because I think the Catholic Church in Ireland is in a very deeply traumatized place, much more so than the Church of Ireland. And I believe it's going to take a long, long time for the Catholic Church to recover those eulogy characteristics that I think are really precious.
I want to come on to talk a little bit about national identity in a moment, but I just wanted to ask Andrew, was there anything coming in there, Andrew, that you might like to draw our attention to, any comments or even questions?
So we've been receiving questions actually throughout the day, because I posted the question earlier on to anyone who was going to be attending this evening. And a reminder, if you want to ask a question this evening, you can do so via Twitter using the hashtag #YourChanceToAsk. And we had a comment which was very, very interesting about marginalised elements in society, which has been touched upon maybe once or twice in the discussions here, and about how they're perhaps being used as a political tool for gain, essentially, both probably here in Ireland and also in the UK. I think specifically the question was in the Irish context, thinking about perhaps the traveller community, particularly immigration, obviously recent immigrants into both the UK and Ireland, and why is there an increasing trend toward these marginalised elements in society being used in this way for essentially political gain?
Okay, and we've seen some examples of that just fairly recently. I mean, we're familiar with them. I won't go into them, but maybe I can come to you on this, Mary McAleese, because one of the points that's made in relation to all of this is the need for people in positions of political leadership to show leadership. And are we getting leadership in relation to these kind of issues, these sort of challenges, as we become a more diverse society, more multicultural, more multi-ethnic?
I would actually be very proud of Irish political leadership and Irish people generally on those issues. I mean, earlier today, Archbishop Dobson referenced the fact, for example, that it was the Church of Ireland that led the way in the Anglican community in ordaining women to the priesthood. I have to say, I belong to a denomination which is so far back along that road. That's really quite depressing. But and we're absent leadership, though not here in Dublin. It has to be said we have a very, very good leader of the Catholic community here in Dublin. But at a general level, we lack that leadership within the overall church. And so we've lost the dynamic of that. And actually, your statistics from earlier in relation to 75%, if you were to ask that question a number of years ago, it would have been 95%. So the trend is downwards. And the same thing, I think, is true of the Church of Ireland. Now more people identify as having no religion as being members of the Church of Ireland. And part of that, I think, has been the slowness of churches generally to shake off a tendency to be very, very self-righteous and exclusive around certain groups of people, women being the obvious ones, LGBTI being another. And you now have, here in Ireland, evidenced by the result of the same-sex marriage referendum back in 2015, we're one of probably still the only country in the world that has changed the law by way of a popular referendum. And it was overwhelming. And that gave you to understand what was going on in the hearts and minds of people who, when they filled out that census form, may very well have said they were Catholic or Protestant for that matter, but still were not driven by the dogma or the hard dogma or doctrine of their churches. These are people who think for themselves now, discuss among themselves, greatly influenced nowadays by an international culture of human rights and human rights discourse and what that means. So it seems to me that when we look now at issues to do with whether it is the Minkeri, the travellers, the Minkeri to use their own language, whether it is people who are coming into our country from many other parts of the world now, whether they come in through the legitimate channels of European Union membership, or whether they are people who are driven by economic or political or conflict circumstances to try and make better lives elsewhere. We are now a very different country. As David said, we're not the same country. Today, 17% of our population comes from somewhere else. They've made their lives here, but they were, imagine 17%. The last time that happened was probably the plantation. And but this has been a different kind of absorption. And I think in general, we have done a really, really wonderful job in absorbing. That is not to say we've done a perfect job. It is not to say that we don't have racists in our midst. It's not to say that some people coming here will experience the kind of racism that breaks your heart and makes you say, hang on a minute. We were the people who were the victims of racism, whether it was in England, no Irish need apply, or in America, or wherever we went to. We have no right to behave like that. And that's when religious sensibility matters, because if you want to appeal to something in the person to change their heart and mind, you have to have some common base. And that common base has got to be about a value system that insists on the dignity and equality of every human being. And so, for me, the religious sensibility, on the one hand, is the default position you go to argue for decency and values, but other people go to that same space, that very same space, to push back against the person of colour, to push back against the LGBTI person, to push back against the women, and they will use scripture, they'll use the scripture in a very, in a dreadfully narrow and provocative way, to corral the lives, to limit the lives of other human beings. So, you know, we're caught in this pincer movement. I mean, Justin referred to it earlier. Right across Europe, we're seeing the growth of movements that are not new. These are not new arguments. They've always been there, but they have been oxygenated, I could say, and of course the social media has helped that hugely. And they find friends very easily now. They can reconfigure. They can find strength in numbers. And I think that I think complacency on the part of those who look at them and are horrified will not serve us well for the future.
And Archbishop, the Anglican Communion is not immune to this.
Tell me about it.
There's a big issue about what it means to be an Anglican in the 21st century.
I'm right, they're wrong. Sorry, that was a joke. That was a joke. Didn't mean that. I'm very often wrong, usually wrong, almost invariably wrong.
Is that called
except on that?
I was going to say, is that the belt of a crozier which we're familiar with here in the past, Archbishop?
No, it's the voice of my children.
Well, tell us what your children are saying about some
You
of these
really
issues.
don't want to know that. I suppose I'm fascinated by this conversation, and I'm going to be really unfair and ask a question in a sense. That these two streams we see, the stream that emerges out of at least a Christian heritage that talks about the dignity of human beings. You don't have to be a Christian to believe that, but it's become part of our culture. Keynes, John Maynard Keynes in the 1920s, writing to a friend, I think it was Virginia Woolf, said in his letter, "We are the lucky generation. We have the values in society, we have the values of our parents, the Christian values of our parents, but we ourselves do not have the obligations." And he went on to say that the power of that tide of Christian values would run out at some point. And it seems to me that in the counter-stream, the narrative of needing an enemy, of the will to power, of othering people, which is so dangerous, and we're seeing across Europe, we have a very strong philosophical stream underlying it. Religion can be used to raise the barriers or to open the gates. Where we're confident about our faith, we open the gates and welcome all in. When, in sociological terms, I think when the world around us changes quickly, the temptation is to use it as an identifier and an identifier against the enemy. We circle the wagons and shoot from inside. Now, the question I ask myself about the next few years is, where do we find a narrative that gives us an identity that will be as powerful as that post-war Christian identity that was at the origin of the sort of what the French call the golden 30 years, and will be strong enough to overcome Schmidt and his acolytes, because his books are selling very well again. They went out of fashion on the 8th of May 1945 for some reason, but they've re-emerged in the 1980s and 90s, and much more so in the last 10 years. And my question is, I wonder where people think we find that narrative, because I find it in Christian faith, in what Mary was just saying.
Well, can I put that question to Ida, because and suggest to her that the Church of Ireland tradition on the island of Ireland has been one that has been a broad church. Is that fair? I mean, is that when you look at the history of the Church of Ireland denomination, is that what you see? A church that has encompassed from the evangelical to the to the much more orthodox and traditional, that has encompassed within its walls very many different views and been able to have an accommodation where people have got along despite their differences and disagreements?
Sure, I certainly think that. I remember when I first came up to Dublin, going out to John's Road and being told that the church out there, it stayed in the YWCA there, that the church out there was high church, and we have very little high church, but that was one element of it, showing that there were diverse aspects to the Church of Ireland, I suppose.
So why was that diversity allowed to exist and to flourish? Why was it? Have you managed to get to the root of what was going on that allowed that tolerance, if you like, to exist?
Maybe it was because we were disestablished and we could take that kind of pathway. I'm not quite sure, Brian. It's something that we continue to discuss within the book and to look at, different ways of different versions of Protestantism, if you like, or different existences of Protestantism with the book. Can I just go back a little bit, though, to talking about identity and multiculturalism and things like that? In the last year, I teach in Carlow College. It's a very small college, 600 or 700 pupils, but we have a very diverse student base. And because of various issues that were coming through in Irish life and the growth of fascism in Europe and other places, if we'll put it like that discreetly, we thought it was a good idea to explore the idea of identity. And we have a humanities course in which we did it through different themes, through sociology, through philosophy, through history. And I think the idea, one thing that came across to me very much about it was how difficult it actually is to negotiate that multiculturalism within the classroom, and how much, as a historian, it changes the way that I practice. Because, for example, I won't say what country he's from because it could be quite dangerous for him. I had a student from North Africa who told me that he couldn't go back now that he'd passed 18 to North Africa in case he was picked up by the secret police. But he was telling me this in the course of looking at the rights of man, as we were examining the rights of man. And it started him to think, and the rest of the class to think, how that applies today. So that was a question of identity as well. I had another student who was from Turkey, and he spoke about Ataturk in a completely different way to the way I understood Ataturk, in a much more positive light than I would have understood him, which we don't traditionally see him in this part of the world, I suppose. But identity, I think, examining those ideas of identity at third level and at second level should be really a strong focus of what we're doing going forwards, and that it really needs to be addressed.
Well, I wonder though, just to interrupt for 1 second, and it is this, that I wonder, have we, just to go back to this question of the pushback that we're experiencing from ultra-right and from fundamentalism, and also the drift away from churches. Those of us who believe, who purport to believe, who are denominationally conscious but also conscious of something that transcends our denomination, that allows us to see each other as brothers and sisters, are we radical enough? Or are we too complacent and staying within our nice, cosy, whatever you say nothing bunkers? Are we too happy with the ecumenical photo op? Have we been radical enough? I don't believe we have. The only really radical thing that I have seen in recent times that gave me a little bit of hope was when Pope Francis earlier in February this year met the Grand Imam in Abu Dhabi, and they issued a fraternal declaration. And on back of that, within months, the Deputy Prime Minister of the Emirates was in Rome saying, what will we do together now? Why? Because both of those traditions, the Islamic tradition, the Catholic Church is the biggest NGO in the world, 200,000 schools serving 60 million kids, I don't know how many, hospitals, clinics, the biggest in the world. But Islam is also a major charitable NGO. Do they know what each other does? No, they stand off from each other. Do they work together? No. But now we see that faced with a world that is saying, you're not radical enough, you're not talking to each other enough, and for that reason, we are losing faith in what you preach. Now I think I begin to see an embryo of understanding that they really do have to be much more radically engaged with one another.
And is that Archbishop, what you were alluding to when you talked about, you said it's a falsehood to say that the churches should not be engaged in politics. They have a duty to engage. Is that the kind of thing that you were thinking
yes.
about? Yes,
it is, and it's very much that. We're a fraction the size of the Roman Catholic Church, but we're in 165 countries with 85 million people or something like that. And wherever we go, we build clinics and hospitals and schools. That's what we do, and we do reconciliation work, and we do that around the world. And I was in Rome last week meeting Pope Francis, and we were working on follow-up to the joint meeting we had in April, where we got all the political leaders from South Sudan with the former moderator of the Church of Scotland, and the three of us. The Pope used his convening power to invite them. We'd been working in there with a team in there every month for about 2 years at that point. We brought them to the Vatican. It's a long story, I won't go into it. And the Pope, we all spent 24 hours together praying and so on. It had a huge impact, particularly at the end with the Pope kneeling and kissing their feet and imploring them to make peace. And when I met him last week, he said, right, we're going to go to South Sudan. And I said, that's a very good idea. He said, we're going to go in March. So I said, that's a very good idea. Yes, I agree. And he said, let's announce it straight away before anyone stops us.
So that's the plan, a March trip to South Sudan.
It's been announced.
I think Andrew has a couple of final comments as we just draw to a close. Andrew?
It's interesting, our audience are interested to get our panel's view about the future of the all-island identity. And there's been a couple of questions about the question of unionist nationalists, how we incorporate different perspectives in this shared identity. One specifically from the Dalkey Book Festival, which I think was aimed at David, actually, I'm pretty sure. Do the panel think that Protestants in the Republic of Ireland have a role to play in reassuring Northern Protestants about a united Ireland, which is inevitable and closer thanks to Brexit?
Okay.
Well, I mean, it's very clear that the biggest issue for us in this country is unification. Reunification, unification, change in the constitutional status of this country. It is coming because demography dictates. If you look at the referenda, or if you look at the last census in Northern Ireland, the Catholic stroke nationalists, I know we can say whether this is right or wrong, majority is coming. And whether it's a decade, 2, 3, and we have got to prepare in our heads first for this enormous change, and we've got to figure out how we deal with the wounded party in this eventuality, who will be the Unionists, in the sense that, when Mandela came out of prison, he didn't raise his hand to his own people. He went straight to the Afrikaners and he said, you have a place in this country. This country is yours as well. And I really, again, because of my personal background, I can feel the anxiety in Northern Unionists. I can really feel it. And that has changed over the last 25 years. In the last 5 years, and since Brexit in particular, there is an anxiety about what's coming down the road, which is a change in the constitutional status. And if we allow one party, not just political, but one identity, to own that new Ireland and own the narrative, then I think we're in for a serious political, social upheaval here, the likes of which we have no understanding of. So consequently, I think there is a role for Southern Church of Ireland, Presbyterian people, particularly Church of Ireland, to say, your fears are overreactive at this stage, because their political leaders will not do anything, as far as I can see, except exacerbate anxiety. That's what they do, right? And consequently, what I think about Irish identity is the questions of Irish identity will not be academic or semantic or theoretical or ecumenical. In 10 or 15 years' time, it'll be real. Who are you? Where do you belong? Can you stay here? If not, are you going to fight about it? If you're going to fight about it, what do we do about it? So this, because I visit Northern Ireland all the time, seems to me the question of identity. That this republic, because it's going to be the dominant power in this transition, we need to start talking to each other and using the Church of Ireland's experience here as a lever into their minds. Because if we continue to ghettoise Northern Irish Protestants, stroke Unionists, they will naturally fear the worst. And consequently, I think there's a massive role for the Anglican Church, both in the UK and here, to begin to have the conversations realistically.
I mean, the complicating factor clearly is Brexit, because it undermines one of the basic principles of the Good Friday Agreement, which was that your identity could be in Northern Ireland British or Irish, Irish and British and European.
Yeah.
And that is clearly facing a major...
But Brexit has just made slightly more speedy a demographic eventuality that was coming anyway.
I've overrun a bit, but I'm not going to leave this and conclude until I'd like to hear from Dr. McAleese as well on this, because you did so much during your presidency, as we know, to build those bridges, to reach out, particularly your contacts in the loyalist community in Northern Ireland, which didn't really have a voice politically. Yourself and your husband Martin, who's here tonight, really worked so tirelessly to build those contacts and those relationships. How do you see that relationship evolving now in the kind of change and flux that we're potentially facing?
Well, first of all, I think David has analysed it very well. It's in front of us. It has to be faced. The demographics are moving in that direction. But they're moving in that direction. They're moving in the direction, for example, of a northern nationalist or Catholic majority, which may or may not translate into support for United Ireland. They're also moving, thanks to Brexit, in terms of creating a new constituency of people who may very well see themselves as European but unionist, who could, if the circumstances were offered to them, perhaps make a choice to join a United Ireland in order to remain in Europe, because they would have that opportunity offered to them. As you know, one of the things that Enda Kenny was able to secure in the immediate aftermath of the referendum in Britain on Brexit was a guarantee from all the European countries, including Britain, that if Northern Ireland ever opted in favour of United Ireland, it would automatically and seamlessly come back into the European Union. That actually has been a very helpful thing, because it sort of softens the argument. It also allows us to move way beyond the wrap the green flag round me, right past wrongs. We really, really have to abandon the old narrative around a United Ireland. We have to create a new narrative around a new reconciled Ireland, where, as David said, everyone is welcome, everyone is embraced. Now, funnily enough, I think the fact that all the religions, the religious denominations and faiths and groupings on this island, they're all cross-border. And I honestly think that they're a phenomenal strength that nobody really has looked at, because we tend always to poo-poo religion, to regard it as problematic, to regard it in some ways we're almost we're dismissive of it. And yet here is a powerful tool and resource. We have church-going people, we have people who are related to church-going people, we have community halls, we have a dynamic here of a shared Christian value system, which is expressed in ways today that are very, very different from 10, 20 and 30 years ago. And I think that actually our churches, as we move forward, have a huge role to play. I've often thought that if I go back to the Good Friday Agreement and the process that led to it, one of the things that we never gave any credit for was that everybody who eventually agreed on the Good Friday Agreement, and ultimately the St Andrews Agreement that brought in the DUP or the Paisleyites, they all had a common background in Christianity. And they might have thought that they were more Christian than the others, or they might have thought that Catholics weren't Christian, and Catholics might have thought that they weren't very Christian. But that's not the point. They had a formation in Christian thinking, in the Beatitudes, in forgiveness, in loving your neighbour, and somewhere or another that leached into the body politic and into civic discourse. And I think that's the great, churches aren't embarrassed to use this language.
Yeah, it comes naturally, absolutely. Just a final comment from our other two guests on this question, the future for us on the island as a whole, Ida.
Could I make two very quick points? One is that I think Protestants in the South play a very important role in shifting the game here and having conversations with Protestants in the North to change the game. Whether it's you do it around your own kitchen table or whatever means you choose to do it, but I think it will change the future for all of us on the island. And the other point is that we each have to move these feet a little bit, left and right, to change our view of what a united Ireland would be like. Correct. Each one of us needs to explore that idea and to examine it. And that way, maybe we can persuade our brethren in the North to come in.
Yeah. And some final thoughts from an Englishman on the way ahead for
Want
Ireland.
to join the United Ireland?
We'll give you a passport.
I think
Honorary, no problem.
I think on the role of the churches, the role of all Christians is overwhelming. Reconciliation is the Christian gospel. We are called to be peace builders, peace strengtheners, the people who serve others, who seek peace. As to the question of the identity of Ireland and a united Ireland, every now and then, very rarely, I think it is much more important for an Englishman to be on receive than transmit.
Well, thank you very much.
I thought you were going to be political. Sorry.
Thank you indeed. Thank you for transmitting in the course of the evening. I'll draw the proceedings to a close there. My apologies to the Dean because I have rather overrun Dean, but I felt the conversation, just particularly as we came towards the end there, was really important that we pursued it, and I hope I haven't discommoded anybody by overrunning a little bit. I think Swift would have been fascinated to have been part of our discussion here tonight. And he would have had plenty to say, no doubt. A previous dean here, Victor Griffin, described on one occasion getting correspondence addressed to Dean Jonathan Swift, the deanery, St Patrick's Cathedral. And he sent it back saying no longer at this address. But perhaps he's here in spirit. Certainly, I think in terms of the insights and the dynamic discussion we've had, it meets the Swiftian criteria, I would hope. So, ladies and gentlemen, on your behalf, can I thank our panel this evening, Archbishop Welby, Dr. Mary McAleese, David McWilliams and Dr. Ida Milne. Thank you very much. And to Andrew as well for managing our social media at the end. So that's it. Thank you for being with us and a safe home and a very good night to you. Thank you indeed.
Thank you, Brian.
Cheers, Brian. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.